So what's happening here? That's the intriguing thing. And I call this echoing, but really what this makes you think about is, you know, why does Ambedkar quote Dewey sometimes and other places use words or phrases from Dewey without explicitly putting quotation marks around them? Now you don't see this in any of his academic essays. You don't see this from other authors other than Dewey. I haven't seen this at least. And it only appears in his public address or things that were intended for public address. So this really is an interesting theoretical question. And it's a rhetorical one. Why do we quote things in our speeches to others? So you look at, people like Gary Saul Morson and others that define quotation, and you see kind of a nice definitional starting point where quotation repeats the words, or if you quote the actions of another, as the words or actions of another. And that starts to give me an entry point in this book to explain the rhetoric that Ambedkar's pragmatism kind of results in or entails. It's one that worries about force. As I mentioned before, in 1915, 1916, one of the problematics he gets from Dewey is how much form do you need to have effective reform? How much force do you need for effective reform? And how much force goes too far? So, for instance, in 1918, he talks about Bertrand Russell's book, which was all about the cycle of violence associated with World War I. You think your country's right, so you go to war, you'll probably be just as oppressive or violent as the other country. That's Russell's book in a nutshell. So Ambedkar is wrestling with this idea. You need force, but you can't have too much force or you become that which you wanted to resist in the first place. So think about force and think about quotation. And you can think about a spectrum here. I call it the quotational force spectrum. There's a sense where you could just be talking with no one else being brought into a conversation or pointed at through quotation, implicit or explicit. There's a sense where you could be all, your words could all be a quotation from someone else. Call that mediumship, where a spirit speaks through you, or if you're interpreting in a dramatic fashion, a play or a writing or a speech by someone else. Now, most of our engagement in rhetoric, in everyday rhetoric, falls in the middle of that, where that X is. Most of the time we talk and we will point to experts or sources or authority. We'll bring in quotations that we want to refute or problematize. So most of our quotational practice happens in the middle there. But if you think about this spectrum, not just in terms of what you're doing, but what you achieve by doing it, you start to see why Ambedkar would be using this rhetoric of echoing in so many of these public address instances. So, for instance, in 1919, the British people on the Southborough Committee, and the upper caste Indians on that committee, they knew very little of Dewey. Dewey didn't have much penetration into the market of India or the UK. So there wasn't a sense where he would get anything by pointing towards Dewey. And there's a sense where he loses some force if he points towards Dewey on democracy, because then the next step is necessary. You'd have to clear up that I also agree with what Dewey is asserting about democracy. So there's a sense where the directness of his address and the reworking of Dewey becomes reconstructive. And you could see this when he explicitly quotes Dewey in Annihilation of Caste. He explicitly quotes Dewey's words at two spots in Annihilation of Caste. And there, this passage is very important for understanding Ambedkar's rhetoric. He said, Professor John Dewey, who is his teacher and to whom he owes so much, says every society, and here he's quoting Dewey from Democracy and Education, gets encumbered with what's trivial, with dead wood from the past, and with what's positively perverse. As a society becomes more enlightened, it realizes it's responsible not to conserve and transmit the whole of its existing achievements, but only such as make for a better future society. Now, what's interesting to this is you see the ellipses, the three dots in the middle of that passage. What did Ambedkar cut out? That's Ambedkar's, excision there. Well, if you look at any copy of Democracy and Education, but here's Ambedkar's highlighted copy in the margin, I've added boxes that show you what he cuts out of that passage. He leaves out Dewey's specific subject matter. Dewey is at this part of Democracy and Education talking about how formal education is charged with reconstructing a society's past. Now, that wouldn't do for Ambedkar because the problems that he faced with caste oppression went beyond access to education. It was part of it. It was not the whole of it. So what you see here is fascinating. Dewey proffers Reconstruction in his pragmatism. Ambedkar sees this notion of reconstruction, this orientation, reconstruct the past to meet the present and future need, your present and future need. But he also sees that Authors on Reconstruction, like John Dewey himself, are part of the past that themselves can represent resources and things to be reconstructed. So, put very simply, Ambedkar is reconstructing Dewey's passage on Reconstruction. So, you start to look at these texts where he's doing this, and you start to see what he's doing very differently. He is making major changes in, how this passage or this word or this phrase was used by Dewey. So, for instance, Dewey in Democracy and Education, critiques Plato quite severely. Ambedkar sees in Plato's divided republic a sort of caste system, and he takes those phrases and those sentences and retasks them to be a very explicit and harsh critique of the caste system that he experiences in the Indian tradition. So again, not the point Dewey's making, but he sees that Dewey's view of Reconstruction and the resources Dewey offers can be used in his own novel endeavor.